Okay, so we're moving on to ancient Greece, and I'm just going to give you a quick background of how we went from the prehistoric and Neolithic Greece to ancient Greece and the geometric and archaic art. So the Mycenaean palaces are destroyed in 1200 BCE, and that destruction um, sort of ends the traditional social order that they have built. Um, the disappearance of the kings of Mycenae result in an ancient dark ages where knowledge like temple building and tomb building and funerary cities is lost. And the economic independence that Greece had found is lost. In about the 8th century, Greece becomes a bit more stable. And because of that, we see a new social order begin. They develop a culture out of a synthesis of Aegean and Indo-European peoples that rule the separate city-states. So they're arranged just like ancient Sumeria was. The individual city-states, or the Greek word polis, are sort of in charge of their own stuff. Each city-state has its own local deity that they worship, and they have their own local government. Right now, what you're looking at map-wise is all of the land that encompasses Greece at the beginning of the Greek time. You've got the Cyclades, the island of Crete, and all of the mainland, plus you've got Asia Minor, and we think part of Italy. So, who's who in ancient Greek mythology? I'm just going to talk about this briefly. It'll be in the Delve Deeper if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about ancient Greek mythology. But obviously, ancient Greek mythology is a huge topic, meaning that, people have PhDs on ancient Greek mythology. So, I'm going to tell you an overview. That's a real quick overview. In the grand scheme of things, it's probably a very small nuts and bolts idea. Okay, so first we have the god who is the sort of father of all of the gods. His name is Zeus. The Romans call him Jupiter. Zeus rules the sky and allots the sea to his brother, Poseidon. The underworld belongs to Zeus's other brother, Hades. His weapon is a thunderbolt, and with it, he leads the other gods to victory over the giants who had challenged the Olympians for control of the world. Hera is his wife and is sister of Zeus. You're going to find that a lot. Lots of inbreeding. Hera was the goddess of marriage. Poseidon, or Neptune, is Zeus's brother. He rules the sea. He controls the waves, the storms, the earthquakes with a 3-pronged pitchfork called a trident. Hestia, or in Roman Vesta, is the sister of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hera. Hestia was the goddess of the hearth. Demeter is the third sister of Zeus, and she's the goddess of grain and agriculture. Ares is the god of war and is Zeus's son. And he is Aphrodite's man. His Roman counterpart is Mars. Athena is the goddess of wisdom and warfare, and she is a virgin. She was born from a woman's womb, but from the head of her father, who is Zeus. Hephaestus is the god of fire and metalworking. He is the son of Zeus and Hera. Apollo is the god of light and music. Artemis is the sister of Apollo. Aphrodite is the daughter of Zeus and Dion. She was the goddess of love and beauty. Hermes is the son of Zeus and another nymph. He was a fleet-footed messenger of the gods. He sort of straddles both worlds, the earth and the heavens. Dionysus is the son of Zeus. He is the god of wine. He's the party god. Eros is the son of Aphrodite, and Asclepios, who I've never heard of before, is the son of Apollo and a mortal woman. So there you go, a basic rundown of the Greek gods and goddesses. All right, so let's move on to art. Sorry it takes so long to set ancient Greece up. It gets a little bit more complicated, certainly not as complicated as Rome. Okay, so Greece moves out of the Dark Ages. So what happens is all the Mycenaean mainland communities or peoples, they are their economy like shuts down, and when the mainland's system falls, Greece enters into a Dark Ages. So all of the technology that had been developed goes by the wayside for a while. And as the people begin to wake up, a new style of art emerges. This art is characterized by geometric shapes and abstraction. Greek artists are exposed to Eastern works in areas like Syria and Egypt. The animals that are popular in the East are represented by Greek artists, so we know that they still have retained some information from trade, whether by trading by themselves or through tradition. And Egyptian style is somewhat retained in the works of art. So this is the geometric crater. It is from the Typhon Cemetery in Athens, Greece. It's about 3.5 feet high, and it's at the Met in New York City. When you see this work of art at the Met, it sits above eye level, and so it feels large. It is very large for a vase. If you think about how tall 4 feet tall is, that's about the size of a 4-year-old child. So it's a pretty big vase. It's a new style of art that comes about because social order in the 8th century becomes more concrete. And due to social customs and social practices, we see a new style of art come about called geometric and orientalizing art. This particular vase was used to mark a grave site in the Typhon Cemetery, and we're going to look at quite a few things from the Typhon Cemetery here in the next few slides. This particular vase tells the story of the death of a Trojan soldier, and it marked the grave of a fallen soldier. We know that they cremated, so it may have held cremation remains. We are not 100% sure, but we do know it memorialized a warrior. Here's a close-up of the belly of the pot, and that close-up helps me to tell you a little bit more about the narrative devices that they use to tell of the story of the Trojan soldier. So at the very top, you see that traditional Greek key pattern. We call that a meander. It is the pattern that we most commonly associate with Greece. You see it at the foot of the pot and at the top lip of the pot. The next Register down, you see a soldier laying across a table. He is dead and he's being presented for burial. There are people that run the entire circumference of the pot, called wailers. Now, this may seem a little odd to you, but because it's definitely not part of our culture. In our culture, when somebody dies, we're very quiet. We go to a funeral home, we cry, and we say goodbye to our loved one. Well, that's not how that worked in ancient Greek society. In fact, lots of things in ancient Greek society are a little bit different than they are here in our neck of the woods. But back in the day that this young man passed away, if you were someone of importance, you would hire people called wailers. Wailers were people who were very vocal about your passing. The more important you were, the more wailers you had. Why? Because they were expensive. They were people for hire to mourn your death. And they would, in a parade of presentation for your service, the Greek folk would walk around with your body through the streets, getting it ready for burial. I'm assuming they would have used some sort of funerary service, and so the body would be transported to the funerary service. But the wailers would run around the city crying and screaming and yelling in distress for your death. You can see that the people are presented in a very abstract way. You have a triangle for the upper part of the body. The legs are more of an organic shape, as well as the hips, but they're still very simple. They're simplified. It's a picture on a vase. You wouldn't think that vase painting could be intricate. It does develop into something very intricate, but this is part of the hallmark of the geometric and archaic orientalizing style. That very simplified shapes used to describe an object, as well as highly patterned areas like the meander that we see on the vase. So in the next register down, you see a homage to the soldier. You see a man who's standing on the back of a chariot with a horse. You see that the horse has many pairs of legs and many heads. That is to represent dimension. There's more than one horse there, but also to represent movement, just like we saw in the ancient Near Eastern standard of having multiple legs, multiple heads equaled movement. Then to the right of that, you see these strange looking shields that are in the shape of a rounded capital I. And then to the left, you see more soldiers and horses and chariots. The foot of the pot is probably 18 inches tall, fairly tall. The vase in diameter is really, really large. It's not only tall, it's equally as large. I would say at least 3 to 4 feet in diameter. It was used to mark a grave at the Dyflon Cemetery, and we don't know if they would have used the vessel for something like crematory ashes or something like that. We just are not certain. But you can see lots of pattern going on and that abstract shape that is characteristic of geometric and orientalizing art. This is the Monteclasse Apollo. He is made using the lost wax process. If you remember discussing the Akkadian portrait of Sargon, you remember me saying that this technology of the lost wax process casting is a mark in sophistication, or a what do you call that? A foundation point. It's a way to judge how sophisticated a society is. If they have this technology of the lost wax process, then they're looked at as a more sophisticated society with an advanced system of scientific research and development. The Monte Claus Apollo, you can see, is created in a very abstract way. The form of the body are basic shapes. You have a large triangle for the top half of Monte Claus Apollo's body, and the bottom are sort of oval legs. Then at one time we think he had lower legs, but they have since been broken off. You can see that he wears his hair down his back, tied in rows. And if you look closely at his face, there are holes in the sockets for eyes. We think that perhaps there was some sort of precious material that was inlaid there to create dazzling-looking eyes. This statue is dedicated to the god Apollo, and he is a votive offering. He's a votive offering, and we know that because there's an inscription on his legs, and I'll read it to you in a moment. But we know that society is beginning to become a lot more sophisticated just by the fact that this was done in the last wax process. So the statue says, this statue is dedicated to, as a tithe, to the far-shooting Lord of Silver Bow. You, Apollo, might give some pleasing favor in return. So the Greek gods were represented in human form all the time. So we don't know if this particular statue is of Apollo or if it's of Monte Claus. We're just not sure. You do see some representation of pectoral and abdominal muscles done in line work, but they are fairly generalized. Here you can get a good reference for how big the statue is by looking at the person who's standing next to the statue in the museum. You see it's about the size of her face. Here's a detailed image of the Monte Claus Apollo. You can see the generalization in terms of the pectoral muscles and the leg muscles. You also get a close-up of the writing on the upper thighs, and then again the back side of the statue. You can also see a good representation of the hair, how the hair falls down to the shoulders and is tied off in rows. That hairstyle is a stylistic feature of geometric and archaic art. This is the hero and centaur. It is, again, a bronze statue. It is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And you can see that we think the hero is Hercules. And that the person that's standing in front of him is actually the centaur. I know the centaur looks a little off. We're going to talk a little bit about why the artist may have represented the centaur in a more human body form, but it seems as if he kind of attaches the back side and the belly of the horse to a full standing human. It's very small. It's only about 4.5 inches high. I mean, if you think about how big 6 inches is, it's not very big. So a little bit shorter than that. So the man who's standing there represents Hercules. He's fighting with the centaur. Why? Because he wanted to go to a party. Hercules did, and he took his fiance with him. They're going to a party to honor Dionysus, the party god, the wine god, and they have to go across a river and to the place of the party. And so Hercules gets to the party, and the story goes that the bride decides after a bit that she wants to go home. And the centaur offers to walk Hercules' bride home for him so that the bride is safe. Hercules agrees, and the centaur, while walking the bride home, assaults his bride. The story goes that you can see, well, for one thing, you can see who the winner of the argument is. It's Hercules, because he is taller, right? That's our hierarchy of scale. As far as the centaur goes, I think that they represent him in more of a human-like form, because without representing the focus of the human-like form, you end up with less focus on the story of how they ended up fighting of the assault. So I really think that that is why he's represented in such a human-like form, is because it helps to tell the story. The centaur is a Greek innovation. I can't remember, because I haven't taken mythology class, but I can't remember. I think that the centaur is sort of an evil character in general. He's sort of malicious. But I would encourage you, if you're interested in those type of Greek mythologies, to look them up. All right, so this is another example of early Greek vase painting. This is black figure technique, which we'll talk about red figure and black figure technique later, when I can kind of give you a comparison of the two. But the thing that you need to know about this that's important is that the pattern is hor vacui, and that the vessel is called an amphora. Now, you're going to be introduced to many different types of vases. The way I remember that an amphora is that it has ears like an animal. And you see how the handles make, I don't know, they're large, they bridge the neck and the shoulder. They look like the ears of the pot. So I remember ears equal amphora. You can see that the animals that are presented to you on the vase are not all animals that exist in Greece. There's lions, there's large birds. I think there are some mythological animals on there as well. Marduk the dragon, I think, is the one that's on here. These animals are influence of Asian trade, so from Asia Minor. So they would have seen those particular animals through trade. If you remember, lions in Egypt and in ancient Mesopotamia were very popular motifs of strength. So we know that they traded, and we know that through records like these, because they have animals on them that didn't exist in Greece. In addition to, this pot has a lot of just really beautiful skill in terms of the design on the pot. Okay, so we've just finished the Greek Orientalizing period, geometric and orientalizing period, and now we're going to move on to Greek Archaic. The Archaic period began at about 600 BCE and lasted till 480 BCE, We know that the Greeks were seeing lots of Egyptian architecture. They include a new stylistic hallmark or technique called the archaic smile, which I'll point out to you is an indication of knowledge. And they still retain the conical rectangular shape of the block of stone from the statue that the statue was sculpted from. Here you see the Lady of Auxerre. She is about 2 feet tall. She's in the Louvre. She's pretty small. I remember being in the Louvre and walking right past her and sort of missing her and having to go back because she is a smaller size statue. Oftentimes, I think she gets missed. Here you see some of the basic hallmarks of archaic Greek art. For one thing, there is a prominent eyebrow and 2 wide-set almond-shaped eyes. The hair is neatly coiffed into rows and tied off at the ends. The Lady of Auxerre wears traditional Greek dress, Greek woman's dress, with a meander pattern on the skirt. Her fingers are not all that detailed, remembering that she's fairly small, but she also wears a sort of shawl around her shoulders called a chiton. She holds her hand up to her breast, and we believe that the Lady of Auxerre is actually a goddess. So goddesses in the archaic period often wore headdresses, and we aren't seeing that here. So there is some question as to whether or not she's goddess or mortal, but she's dressed just like any Greek woman would be who was being represented in art. So this is the New York Choros. The New York Choros is an excellent example of the archaic style that begins early Greek art. So we know that they traded a lot with Egypt, and the early archaic sculptures reflect the Egyptian idealism that we saw in the Ka statues in the Old Kingdom. They retain the shape of the block of stone in which they were carved from. You can see that by the very tall, erect stance that the sculpture retains, as well as the very stiff rigidness of the figure. He holds his arms down to his sides and he stands upright, very tall. The arms being close to the sides is a protection mechanism for the sculpture. They were constantly worried that they were going to lose limbs and things like that. They knew that earthquakes were a common part of their everyday society. And so they want to make sure that if the statue topples over, it's not going to lose an arm or a leg. And so they usually carve them close to their sides in closed form to make sure that they don't break off. We call that tensile strength, how strong the sculpture is. You can see that the Choros figure steps 1 foot in front of the other as if he's going to walk off of the block of stone. In addition to, he is sculpted with great attention to anatomical structure. The Choros statue reflects a few different things in Greek society that are important. We'll talk about them in just a second, but first I want to tell you sort of the story behind the Koros. The Koros figure is usually a work of art that represented or paid honor to a person in Greek society. So in this case, they're paying honor to a young man who probably was lost in war, to the Trojan War. Families, whenever the battalion of troops came back to their home country or back to their home, if the young man wasn't in the group of young men who returned, they would often create a statue and dedicate it to the gods as a thank you for the child's life or for the young man's life. They were votive offerings to the gods, and they always represented the young soldier in an idealized fashion. The Greeks are very big on this concept called arete. Arete means the perfection of the mind, body, and spirit, and they're always striving for that perfection. The people that have the perfect arete were the gods. And so anytime they were bettering themselves, they looked at it as an offering to the gods. Okay, so there's the story of the Koros. Now let's talk about the stylistic features that link this particular figure to the hallmarks of early Greek art. For one thing, the fact that the sculpture retains the shape of the block of stone is a hallmark of early Greek sculpture. You see very little movement. They're very stiff and rigid. That is a hallmark of early Greek sculpture. In antiquity, they would have been painted. Red, for some reason, red hair is highly coveted. And so oftentimes the statues are polychromed with red hair. And great attention has been paid to the nude form of the body. You can see that the hair is tied in rows neatly down the back. And you can see that the artist has taken great care to suggest muscle structure. I think you can see that really well in the back side of the Koros sculpture. The muscle structure of the thighs and the backs of the legs is very detailed. There's a lot of line work to indicate muscle structure, prominent pelvic triangle, and there's not a lot of modesty that goes towards these statues because the young men were very young, and they were, like I said, presented in a way that is idealized. The face is somewhat less soft and detailed. We still have those large almond-shaped eyes with very prominent brows. The eyes are not always open wide. Sometimes they're open. Sometimes they've inlaid them with precious material. A lot of times they were painted. They have a little bit of a smaller mouth. And we're going to see a new convention called the archaic smile. This one does not have an archaic smile yet. So here we have another Koros figure. This Koros figure is called the calf bearer. And he looks a little bit different than the last calf bearer, or the last Koros figure that we saw. For one thing, he's quite a bit older than the last Koros we saw. And so he wears a thin material cloak over his shoulders to provide a sense of modesty for him. Here is one of the most important hallmarks that we associate with the archaic style, and it's called the archaic smile. It's a slight smirk on the face of the sculpture that is to indicate that there's thought going on in someone's head. So if you stop and think about it, you know how you kind of get this like half smile when you're irritated or when you're kind of frustrated with something? That half smile is attached to there's a thought going on in that person's head. And so by presenting a half smile, the Greek artist feels that is evidence of thought. So the calf bear, this particular calf bear was found in the Acropolis. It's now at the Acropolis Museum. From this point on, this establishment of the archaic smile is the norm for sculpture. You see that the eyes have been drilled out so that some sort of precious material would have been inlaid in them. We have a little bit more natural of a representation of the hair, still tied off in rows, still around the back. This one is coming forward, the hair comes forward a bit because the young man has a calf wrapped around his neck. He is taking the calf to Athena as a thank you for his good fortune. His name is Chronobus, and the statue itself is a votive offering to Athena, but the calf would be sacrificed as an offering to Athena as a thank you. The artist does another thing that's pretty ingenious in terms of taking our attention away from the nudeness of the young man, and that is that he places the calf around the back of the young man's neck, and he holds the calf's feet with his hands, creating an X, a large X composition in the front of his chest. That X draws dramatic attention to the presentation of the calf, but also attention away from the nudity of the Koros. You can see the center of his abdomen it's been taken great care to describe his abdominal muscles, the muscular form of the forearms, as well as the muscular form of the upper thighs. Those things all speak to arete, the perfection of the mind, body, and spirit. And you see that if he actually had lower legs and feet, they would have been stepping one foot in front of the other, just the way the New York Koros that we just looked at would have looked at like. This man was likely a prominent member of society, and we know that he was dedicating the calf to Athena because the part of the pediment that he was standing on has been found. It had an inscription on it. So this is Kroisos from Anavissos, Greece. This Koros figure was found in a cemetery. It was a cemetery, it was the Anavissos cemetery. At any rate, about 530 BCE, there was a young man named Kroisos that died in battle, and this statue was created to commemorate his life. You can see that the archaic hallmark of retaining the shape of the block of stone from which the statue was carved is still very much at play here in Kroisos. His arms are attached to his thighs, while that extra material that we see in the New York Choros has kind of been hidden by the arms attaching directly to the hips. They're still attached, as well as you can see that more attention to detail in terms of the muscular structure of the body has been played up here in this particular work of art. Fortunately, we see a lot of the paint that was original in antiquity. So that red hair that was highly coveted is painted. We know that this was not likely a portrait. It was a celebration of arete. It was a celebration of the perfections that the gods give to people. You can see the more gradual sculpting of the flesh. It has a sense of fleshiness to it that the New York Choros didn't have. Of course, we have the archaic smile. The hair lays down the back in rows, just in archaic fashion, as well as we get a defined pelvic triangle. The statue was painted in antiquity. We talked about that a minute ago, but the eyes would have been painted in detail. You get a better idea of how important this statue is when you compare it to the New York Choros. So we're going to do that in just a minute. I just wanted to also point out to you there is something that we study in Greek mythology called hubris. Hubris is an overwhelming or inflated sense of pride. And the Greek ideal is to be sure that one isn't overinflating themselves or is sort of getting too big for their britches, as my grandma would say. And so arete has a double-edged sword. If it's focused on too much, then sometimes it's celebrated overly. If it's not focused on enough, then it's not a positive dedication to the gods. You can see the Choros retains that stiffness that we saw in the New York Choros that is reminiscent of Egyptian sculpture. And there was an inscription found on the statue that said, "Thank you for Croesus's life." So we definitely know that it was a dedication to Croesus. Here you can see a comparison of the Croesus Choros with the New York Choros. Similarities wise, you can see that the stance is very similar. They both have that rigid retaining of the block of stone. They also have the archaic smile, even though the New York Choros not as much as the Anavasas Choros. The big difference here is in the realism of the representation of the muscle structure in the statue of Croesus. Croesus's hair falls more naturally. It feels more lifelike. It has a little bit more movement, has a bit of waviness. His face is fleshier than the New York Choros. And part of that just has to do with the fact that the New York Choros represents an earlier time than the Navasas Choros. We'll also see a difference in the hyperrealism of the representation of the muscle structure in Croesus. Well, this is a chore. A chore is the female version of the male Choros. She is a goddess. We know this because she actually wears 4 different garments. Only someone who was a goddess would have been important enough to wear 4 different garments. She's depicted in a much more natural way than the Lady of Auxerre that we saw in the beginning of the archaic art. Her face has that same softness that we see in the Anavasas Koros. But we don't see much of her body. Her arms are definitely more fleshy. She wears 4 different garments. One of them is that shawl that we call a chiton. There's an underneath garment. It's belted at the waist, and then a garment for the top half of her body. It's sort of like a half shirt. Her hair is long and falls down her back much more naturally than the male Koros figures. And we know that she was a goddess. She's in the Acropolis Museum now, but she came from the Acropolis, and so we know that she represented a goddess. Here we see a departure from that closed form statue that was all tightly tucked in terms of the arms and the legs being compact together in the sculpture. Here you can see that at one point there was an arm that reached forward. What's left of it is the socket with no arm. It's because the arm has since then been lost. So from that standpoint, the idea of sculpting the other Koros figures so that they're so closed formed is important in terms of condition. So at about the 6th century, the style of dress that women wore in ancient Greece changed. It sort of took a dramatic turn. And the new style of dress was a lot more revealing in terms of body shape. And so you get a better idea of what their idealized mindset was in terms of beauty. This garment drapes across the body by being attached, by wrapping around the body and then being attached up at the shoulder. It's made out of a more sheer material that sort of lies more naturally, has more natural stiffness to the fabric. And so you end up with this beautiful cascade of fabric that hugs the shape of the body. The edge here that you see that is dark in color is just leftover chroming from the paint that it had in antiquity. We know that they wore a light linen chiton over top of a heavier garment called a himation during this change. They really liked the intricate folds and the soft cascade in the fabric. And the new dress style seems to make these sculptures appear more lifelike. All right, so we're going to move on to temple building. And I'm going to explain to you basic differences between the Doric and Ionic temples. We will look at lots and lots of examples of Doric and Ionic temples, so don't be too stressed out if it's not clicking right away. First of all, the diagram on the left is for a Doric temple. And the way I remember this is the top of the column that we call the capital is shaped like a giant D. You could also say it's shaped like a drum. I call it the dumb one. Why? Because it doesn't have a lot of ornamentation. Even in the frieze area where you see the triglyph and metope, the triglyph rotates with the metope, and the metope has one single scene. It's a lot more simple than the Ionic order. You can see at the top of the pediment that there's a triangular place, a wide open place that one would put sculpture in. You don't see the full triangle here on this diagram, but I'm telling you it's there. The stylobate is a set of stairs that goes all the way around the building. One of the main things you're going to need to understand is that in Greek architecture, temple building, there are multiple points of entry into the temple, whereas the Roman temple only has one point of entry. So that's one of the major differences between Greek and Roman. Just a fast forward preview for you there. The Ionic temple is a little bit more intricate than the Doric temple. And in intricacy, it mostly has to do with all of the sculpture at the frieze. The sculpture at the frieze in the Ionic temples, the sculpture goes all the way around the building and usually a narrative. You can see, though, in the Ionic order that the top of the column creates this large looking sort of letter I is what I call it. It's the capital letter I. And so it's easy for me to remember that it's Ionic because the columns look like big capital letter I's. Once again, you can see the pediment area is the same. It has a large space for sculpture. And then underneath the pediment is the frieze with that continuous narrative that we talked about. Just like the Doric temple, the Ionic temple has a stylobate in which you can enter the temple from any point, 360 degrees, any point within the temple. So this is a typical temple footprint, meaning it's a schematic drawing or a blueprint type drawing of the floor plan that you see in front. The dots that go all the way around are a representation of the columns, and we call that a colonnade. The lines that go all the way around, those represent the stylobate or the steps. In the center, you have what we call a cella, which is basically a fancy Greek word for a room. The center is also where there's what they call an anteroom, or a room that's attached to the cella. And usually a cult statue would be in that room. It's a place to receive votive offerings for the statue, for the god or the goddess. And then on the other end, the pronos is where you would enter the cella. It's just a room before you enter the cella. This particular temple plan is what we call an archaic temple plan. You're really never going to have to know that. It's just interesting information. Here's the Temple of Hera 1 and the temple plan, or the floor plan that you can see. You can see the colonnade that goes all the way around. We also call that a peristyle. And the cella and the pronos, and then the anteroom here. You see the stylobate where the steps are, where you can enter the entire, you can enter the temple from any point. And this is the Temple of Hera at Paestum, Italy. If you look real close, you could probably decipher what order this temple is in. I will give you a moment. Even though the frieze and tablature and pediment of the roof are all completely gone, the thing that you would have been looking for to figure out what order the temple is in is the top of the capital. And it's shaped like a D or a drum, therefore this particular temple is in the Doric order. This is an archaic temple because of the row of columns that divide the center of the temple. It's Doric in that it's characterized by simple columns and the pillar-shaped capital. It's a classic example of a Greek temple because there are many points of entry. The columns are arranged in a colonnade in the center. Greek architecture really shoots for clarity and balance. It is unique in that architects believe that the ultimate form of balance and beauty that occurs in nature is able to be represented with mathematical phrases. I'll show you more about that when we get to the Parthenon. But for now, just understand that the temple was built in a way that sought harmony and beauty and one with its surroundings. All right, so this is a pediment sculpture from a Doric temple. It is the pediment sculpture represents Medusa and her two hounds that are popular in ancient mythology. The pediment sculpture is made of limestone, and its central height is 9 feet 4 inches. So this was a massive pediment, would have gone to a massive temple. It is done in Doric order. It has a very simplified representation of the imagery that's in the pediment. And you can see that the museum has tried to use a pictorial device of plywood to recreate what the sculpture probably looked like in antiquity. You can see that the Greek artist is paying close attention to how to utilize sculpture and how to represent the sculpture or the imagery within the story in a way that maximizes the space within the pediment. And so they put Medusa in the very center because she's the most important character. She is the main character, but she's also the biggest. So Medusa goes in the middle, and then to her right and left are her hounds that sort of have a triangular shape. Cats have a sort of triangular shape in their body when they pick their head up and look at you. And so they use those shapes to the right and the left of Medusa to create her hounds. And then to the right and left of that are smaller figures that go in the smaller parts of the pediment. I believe they're people who are, I don't exactly know who they are. They have some relationship to Medusa. Medusa is the giant or Gorgarian character that had snakes for hair. In that if you looked at her, you would turn to stone. All right, well, we made it through the sort of temple talk into an important discussion about vases. So the vase on the left is an amphora. Remember, it has animal ears, and so we call it an amphora. And then I'm going to show you different areas on the pot in the vocabulary for the different places in the vase. On the right, we have a crater. And I remember that because I think of the opening of the vase looks like someone dropped a giant crater in it because it's nice and wide and open. Now, there were many, many more vase shapes in ancient Greek society than what you see here. But what you see here are the two main shapes of Greek pottery. Okay, so the vase on the left is a Greek amphora. And I gave you this diagram just so that if for some reason when I'm explaining the pots or the vases to you, you will have some sense of confusion because I'm talking about terms that you're not exactly sure where I'm discussing. You can look back at this particular diagram and go, oh yeah, she means the opening of the vase. For example, for the amphora, when I say the lip, or the shoulder, or the neck. So let's start at the top. The top opening is called the lip. It's that edge at the top of the vase. Then the neck, that is where the lip meets the vertical cylinder here, the neck. And then the handles, of course, that we talked about. And the shoulder of the pot is this swelling that the handle attaches to. The body of the pot is the main bulk of the pot, right? It's the entire belly of the pot. And then of course the foot is that base that the pot stands on. Very similar in terms of anatomy for the Greek crater, just the crater's more open at the top, and so we call that the mouth. It still has a lip and a neck and a shoulder and a body and a foot. The fillet, don't worry about the fillet. That's just a decorative, it's a term for the decoration on the foot. So when it comes to vase painting, the Greeks were very advanced in vase decoration. For one thing, we know more about the artist of vase painting than we do of any other art form at this time, and that's because they lend themselves to having signatures on them on the feet of the vases. But that also tells us that artists in Greek society were often revered for their ability to create. If they weren't revered, then there would not have been motivation to put their name on the work of art. You can see that the shoulder and the belly of the pot are represented here in terms of, or are used here to create this beautiful painting. We've got some old terms that are going to pop up again here. Incising is one of them. You can see the incising on the uniform of the soldier that's playing dice. All of the vase terms, of course, that pop up, and then we're going to look at a new one called black figure technique and foreshortening and noble enemy. So this vase was created by Ezekias, and it's Achilles and Ajax playing a dice game. And what you're looking at is the detail of the amphora. It's from Italy, about 530, so this about the same time of the Anavasas Croesus Koros statue. This amphora is 2 feet high, so 24 inches. The detail is 8.5 inches, so probably a third of the vase is covered in detailed work. The story behind these two is one is Ajax and one is Achilles, and they're playing a dice game. It's a metaphor for their relationship in the Trojan War. And they look at each other as what we call noble enemies. A noble enemy is a worthy adversary, somebody who you would be proud to say you defeated on the battlefield because they sort of were a challenge for you. Sort of the best way I can explain this is to relate it back to Ohio State football, right? So when Ohio State plays Michigan, everybody's all in a big uproar about the fact that Ohio State and Michigan are playing, right? Because they are rivals. They're school rivals, and whoever beats the other has bragging rights. And that is very much the relationship between Ajax and Achilles. Whoever were to defeat the other would have bragging rights. And the challenge of defeating one opponent over the other would definitely be one that would be difficult. Now, if Ohio State were playing Ohio Dominican in football, which obviously this would never happen, but just follow me. If Ohio State were playing Ohio Dominican and they defeated Ohio Dominican, they likely aren't going to advertise that anywhere special because they're supposed to beat Ohio Dominican, right? Ohio Dominican isn't a worthy adversary. So that's the meaning of the noble enemy. Someone who is a worthy opponent, someone who is one that you would be proud to have fought in battle. So I'm going to challenge you here for a minute to stop and really look at this vase and ask yourself which of the two people is the victor in the narrative. Which of the two people in this story is the winner? Okay, put that question on the back burner. We're going to talk a little bit more about the story, and then I'm going to go back to it and ask you that question again. So Ajax and Achilles are playing a dice game, a metaphor for the battlefield. And you see one of them leaning towards the other. Well, they lean towards each other. And you can see that the incising in the uniforms help to create this beautiful detail that is important to the story. You see that they both have shields, you see that they both have helmets, you see that they both have weapons. So it's easy to see that they are people who are fighting in the military. The designs are the white pencil thin scroll work that you see in the uniform representation for Ajax and Achilles. Their cloaks on their backs are highly decorated. They are inlaid with precious shell material, and they are very intricate. You could say that horror vacui goes with the space of the cloak or the design of the cloak, because there's pattern all over that garment. You see one of them is wearing their military hat. The other one has placed the hat on top of the shield. Now let me ask you again, which of the two is the victor on the battlefield? I hope you came up with the guy on the left, the one who is wearing the hat. Why? Simply put, he's taller than the guy on the right. The guy on the right hangs his hat on top of his shield. The shield is presented to you in foreshortening. Foreshortening is a technique that an artist uses to create an object that recedes into space. it's a special type of illustration where the object comes out directly at you. So if you were going to draw a picture of my hand coming directly towards your face, the biggest thing in the picture would be my fist. The smallest thing in the picture would be my shoulder. So foreshortening is a pictorial device that helps an object feel three-dimensional and close to the viewer. The fact that the general has put his helmet on top of the shield means that he is the one who died in battle. The guy on the right is the one that dies in battle. That is Achilles. Now, if you ever took mythology class, you know that Achilles was the one with the Achilles heel, the Achilles tendon. It gets its name because it's a weakness, right? It's in the back of the heel, and the legend goes that Ajax shot Achilles in that spot on the back of his heel that we call the Achilles tendon, and he died on the battlefield. He spent many hours chasing after Achilles, trying to defeat him in battle until he figured out where Achilles' weak spot was on his foot. You also see Ajax's shield being presented to you in foreshortening. The technique in which the pot is decorated in is called black figure technique. Black figure technique is a technique that is created by using something called slip. So if you've ever taken a pottery class before, you know that in order to get the clay to stick together, you use this material called slip. And it's basically a bit of clay that's been highly watered down. That bit of clay helps you to stick a handle on the pot, for example, or you can use it to paint with. And in this case, the artist has used it to paint the image that he wants you to see. And when it goes into the kiln, it's fired, and the places where he painted the slip turn black. That's why we call it black figure technique. Now that was pretty simple. When I get ready to explain red figure technique to you, you'll see that this can actually be a bit tricky. But for now, keep in mind that the black figure technique means that the figures turn out black. I just really wanted to give you a close-up of the detail of the cloaks so you could see the magnificent patterning. The cloaks are just absolutely gorgeous. The stars are created with inlaid precious materials and shells, abalone shells that give the cloak a sense of dimension. You can see the intricateness in the patterning. On the vase, you can see how Ezekias creates pattern or uses pattern to create a sense of depth. You can see the hand and the forearm come out towards the viewer, whereas the lighter color recedes into space, which is created with pattern. Okay, so we looked at Ajax and Achilles. Now let's look at Euphronius. So Euphronius was also a ceramicist, a potter, a painter. We find that in art history today, art historians seem to deem the people who painted the pots in a higher a higher esteem than the people who actually did the crafting and hand building of the vase itself. Both are highly skilled trades. Both are very important. Here you see Hercules wrestling Antaeus. This is done in red figure technique. So remember the slip that we talked about in the last pot of Ajax and Achilles? Well, the slip in red figure technique is used to paint the background. So when the pot is fired, the place where the artist painted black, which is the background, or painted with the slip, turns black in the furnace, which in this case is the background. The part that he doesn't paint stays red because the clay has natural red patina to it. And they do some different things with the clay that oxidize the clay, making it appear more red. So the figures then are red, and we call this red figure technique. I guarantee you at some point you'll get them mixed up or turned around, because sometimes I even get them mixed up and turned around in my head. But if you stick to the rule of whatever color the figure is what you call it. So black figure technique for Ezekias, red figure technique here in this example from Euphronius, it'll help you keep that straight in your brain. Well, Euphronius uses lines to create a sense of space and depth for the characters, which seems a little strange, doesn't it? Lines aren't typically things that we think of that would create a sense of depth, but in Euphronius's case, he does a beautiful job of making the lines move in a direction and by overlapping objects to create an illusion of space. This is an important advancement. It represents a strong sense of research and development, a strong sense of artistic culture, and a strong sense of an understanding of how to study something and the way it moves in space. So you see one gentleman is wrestling the other. And the gentleman with the red hair recedes into space because his head sits behind Antaeus's head. The man with the black hair sits in front of Antaeus. This is Hercules. And so the line work that Euphronius uses to attach sort of Antaeus' head to his body is one that is very angular. You see that it recedes into space and that his legs come out towards you. Now, if you look at Hercules with the dark hair, his head sits in front of Antaeus' head. And so you know his head is closest to you, but his body recedes backwards into space. So it's a sort of play on, play off. So Antaeus' body is closest to us, but his head is furthest away. Hercules' body is furthest away from us, and his head is closest to us. And Euphronius does all of that just by using lines. He uses lines in an angular way to help direct our eye backwards into space, and then the placement of heads and overlapping create a sense of depth. On the right and the left, you also see that Euphronius furthers the point of view of depth by sticking the two women behind the wrestling match. So you get a sense of the idea that the space recedes deeply, or that there's a lot of space between Antaeus's legs and the woman who stands behind the wrestling match. This is a very sophisticated illustration. It has some pattern in it, but the ability to use foreshortening in a way that we haven't seen before is quite remarkable. Exekias does it in Ajax and Achilles playing jacks, but Euphronius does it in a way that deals with anatomy, which is harder to do. If you've ever taken a drawing class, you know that when you're sketching a figure that's laying down, the last place you want to be is at the head or the feet, because it's the most challenging position to draw. Okay, so this is the temple of Aphia. Aphia was a local nymph that the community worshipped. So let me start with asking you, what order is the temple in? So the first thing you should be asking yourself is, okay, where do I look to figure out what order the temple is in? I'm hoping that the answer you came up with is the columns, the tops of the columns. So if you look at the tops of the columns, you think, there's that drum again. Let me look and see if I see anything else that lends itself to Doric. Oh yeah, the frieze. That area that goes under the missing roof has those three lines that rotate with the flat space. That area is the frieze. So when you've got a frieze that has three lines in a flat space, that's called the triglyph and the metope. When they rotate like that, you know you're looking at a Doric frieze. I also know that I'm looking at a Doric column. Therefore, it's safe to assume that this temple is done in the Doric order. Now, we're going to see some that are done in a combination, but for here, this one is done in the Doric order. You'll also notice that the temple is surrounded, or is on the top structure of the temple, surrounded by a stylobate. The stylobate runs all the way around the base of the temple. In the center, you see a colonnade, a cella, and a naos. And then, of course, the columns that run completely around the entire length of the temple, which is the peristyle. In the lower right-hand corner, you see an image of what the temple looked like, or at least what they think the temple looked like in antiquity. It had an enclosed cella. And in the next image, I'm going to show you a pencil rendering of what it probably looked like in antiquity. So the fact that the temple was done in Doric is a reflection that the Greek Empire is changing their style and their grasp of knowledge. The empire is growing stronger. In antiquity, this building represented a demarcation of leaving one style behind and going into the classic style. So this is a pencil rendering of what the Temple of Aegina looked like in Aegina, Greece. You can see that it has an enclosed cella and naos. It was divided with this beautiful lattice work that was likely made of marble, just like the columns. You can see the Doric columns a little bit better, and the Doric frieze that ran around the temple. Here, remember this colonnade that goes all the way around the base of the temple is called the peristyle. And then, of course, you got your stylobate. Those are the steps that go up into the temple. Okay, so here, this is where we would normally do a compare and contrast discussion in class, where I would ask you to tell me similarities and differences between the two statues that you see here in front of you. So I'm going to do this one for you. We will change up how we do this in future online presentations, but for now I'm going to sort of just explain the differences and the similarities to you. So the differences between the image on the top and the image on the bottom become a clue to advancement in technology and sophistication. Let's talk about the similarities first. Similarly, the warriors both lie in a reclining position, and they have almost an identical position in terms of body position. They both recline on one hip, and they lean on the back arm to support their weight. Now, the one at the bottom has a shield, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But to say similarly, they recline in a very similar position. The one at the top has a emphasis on muscle structure, and you can see that they're both represented as being heroic nudes. The purpose of the nudity is to pay homage to their strength and them as a warrior. When looking at the similarities and differences, while they both look very similar from an outside standpoint, they're both made of marble, they're both statues, they both recline. That's about where the similarities end. Let's look at the differences. Okay, the man on the top versus the man on the bottom. The man on the top looks out at what we think is you, the viewer. The man on the bottom looks downward. The man on the top wears his hair in the archaic tradition, tied off in rows, and has it dangling down his back. The man on the bottom has short hair that's underneath the helmet and a beard. So the one on the top has a more youthful look. His face is clean shaven. Beards are something that we associate with age or maturity. The one on the top leans on the elbow. The shield, if he had one, is not in his hand. We assume that the shield would have been in his hand a little bit further away from his body because he's missing the hand. And the natural placement of the shield would have been in front of the arm and connected to the statue. The one on the bottom, the shield is behind his back, behind his head, and his arm rests inside of the shield. The shield helps to support the weight of his body. But the big change here is not only the facial representation, but the way in which the statue looks or interacts with the viewer. Remember, these are pediment statues, so they would have been placed in that triangular space at the top of the temple. So even though the one on the top looks as if he looks outwardly at you, the viewer, he doesn't. He's looking outwards towards the sky. He's way up in the clouds, right? The temple's very tall. He's in the roof line. So he's just looking out into nothingness. Whereas the warrior on the bottom looks downward. He's interacting with the viewer because the viewer would actually be standing on the ground looking upward at him. This is a new sophistication within the discipline. It's a new sophistication in terms of the art being more humanistic. It interacts with the humankind. It makes the warrior seem less exalted and put on a pedestal and more human like. Remember, the Greeks made gods human and humans into gods. And so this is a cornerstone of humanism and a cornerstone of democracy. The idea that the elevated people of society are human beings just like me and you, and that the human being is a measure of society. Just this one simple act of the sculpture, either looking outward or downward at the viewer, changes the meaning of the sculpture so very much. The man on the bottom interacts with the viewer. He's more personable. His interaction with the viewer means that he is more human. Even though he has a more robust development of the muscle structure, he has a more mature facial features. He looks less boy-like and more adult-like. The one at the top carries hallmarks of the archaic style. The image at the bottom carries hallmarks of the new classical Greek era. And so the dying warrior at the bottom begins the new demarcation of early classical Greek art. The dying warrior at the top remains in the archaic tradition. So they're two different eras of art history. Even though they're in the same sculpture, even though they're in the same pediment, even though they're sculpture that are very close to each other in terms of location and in terms of the work of art. They are definitely two different styles of art. They fit into two different stylistic categories. One is the archaic era, the other one is classical Greek. This slide shows you a little bit more clearly how the warrior looks downward at the human standing on the ground. It is the viewpoint that the spectator would have seen when standing on the ground looking up at the warrior. So I've included this slide to sort of help you see the points about where the warriors are located and how the location of the warriors is important in terms of how they relate to the viewer. So the dying warrior at position number 3 is here to the left underneath the recreation or illustration of the pediment sculptures in antiquity. I'm showing you here to the right the pediment of the Temple of Aphia with the arrow to show you where the pediment sculptures would have been. In the center, that is the artistic recreation of what the pediment sculptures would have looked like in antiquity. And then at the top, at placement number 14, is the archaic dying warrior. So you can see how the departure from the archaic into the early classical Greece has now made its transition. So early ancient Greek art becomes more relatable to the viewer. So just like we saw that departure from the archaic into the early classical Greece, the key hallmark of that is that the warrior becomes more relatable. He's looking down at the viewer. You can see his muscle structure. He's older, he's stronger. There is a new focus on lifelike features that we see in the dying warrior. You can see the ripples of his chest muscles. You can see the cave of the chest and rib bones. You can see the gradual way in which the muscles ripple underneath the skin. And technology in Greece is booming at this point. The empire, the ancient Greek empire, is very strong. So this is the Temple of Hera II, or the Temple of Apollo in Paestum, Italy. The temple follows the pattern of the Temple of Apphia in Aegina. And it's one of 3 temples that were located in Paestum. We just saw, before the Temple of Apphia, we saw the Temple of Hera I. Then we saw the Temple of, we saw this one, that's the Temple of Apollo. And the Temple of Zeus was another one of the temples in this area. Unfortunately, the Temple of Zeus lies in ruins. There's very little left of it. And so we always look at this one as a model of what the Temple of Zeus looked like. The special thing about this temple is that when you get to the interior of the temple, there is a cella that has 2 stories. The Temple of Zeus looked a lot like this one. It was in Doric order. It had the rotating triglyph and metope around the frieze, and the columns were similar in number on the short side and long side. But we know that the Temple of Zeus was a lot more lavishly decorated. How do we know that? So we know that the temple was much more lavishly decorated because we have the leftover sculptures from the pediment that adorned the Temple of Zeus. The sculptures were elaborate, and they told a very specific story of a chariot race between Peplos and the King Oinomanos. I think the thing that I want to clarify here to you is that we have 3 temples: the Temple of Hera I, the Temple of Hera II, or the Temple of Apollo, and the Temple of Zeus. When you put all of the knowledge that we have from all 3 temples together, we get a broader picture of what the Greek temple looked like and its function. We know that it was modeled, all 3 of the temples at Paestum, Italy, were modeled after the Temple of Apphia. And we see some design features or characteristics as a carryover. For example, the Temple of Hera II having that double-story cella in the center. In the case of the temple, or the Temple of Zeus, we have these elaborate pediment sculptures. And so we know that the pediment sculptures, when we put all the clues together, were a very important part of the temple. Now, just so that we're clear, worship of the Greek gods and goddesses takes place outside of the temple. The people that are inside of the temple are only priests and priestesses. The priests and priestesses would often provide tithes and offerings to the cult statue that is in the pronos, as well as we see important artwork that are dedicated to the gods and goddesses. In this case, I want to talk to you about the artwork that was at the Temple of Zeus. Okay, so I'm going to try to tell you the story of this myth in simplified terms. It's very detailed, and so let's talk about the sculptures from the east pediment of the Temple of Zeus. The sculptures from the east pediment at the Temple of Zeus face the starting point of the Olympic chariot races in Paestum, and they act out a story of or a myth that dictates the line of succession in Paestum. And so it's a story that talks about deceit. It's a story that talks about hubris and greed. And it's a story of how corrupt the chain of power can become. So, to make a really detailed myth short, there's this king, his name is Onimanos, and then a man named Peplos. The king has a daughter, and the daughter's hand is it is foretold that when the daughter marries, the king will lose his life to the new successor. And that the woman or the man that marries his daughter will actually become king. That man is Peplos. So the king devises a chariot race and says that whoever can beat him at this chariot race would win his daughter's hand in marriage. However, if the suitor would challenge the king to a race and lose, he would be killed by the king. So when it comes time to race, the king possesses the horses that the suitor tends to use. And it always results in the challenger losing the race. Well, one day along comes Peplos, and he knows the king's game. And so he challenges the king to a race and pays a man named Myrtolos to rig the king's chariot to collapse in the race. Peplos wins the race, but when it comes time to pay Myrtolos for rigging the chariot, Peplos drowns him instead of paying him. Right before Myrtolos dies, he casts a curse on Peplos and his future sons. And the tragedy sets the stage for Greek playwrights for a few centuries. The sculptures that are on the pediment at the temple play characters in the story of the tragedy. They seem as if they're on stage getting ready for an event to play out. No one in the lineup of sculptures, or none of the characters that are being represented by the sculptures, really know what's going on, except this one man, the seer. The seer is basically a fortune teller. He's someone who sees into the future. And because he has foreseen what is to come, what is to happen, he has a concerned look on his face. Now, Gardner says that the seer has a look of shock on his face. I don't think I agree with that. Shock is, I think, a little more melodramatic than what the seer is exhibiting. He sort of has a look of, like a look of knowledge that nobody else has. The seer is important because he's a rare depiction of an older person or of a person of older age in Greek sculpture. Most of the time, Greek sculpture represents the arete, the perfection of the mind, body, and spirit. And so that's typically a male in his prime age of 30, 35. And someone who's very physically fit, someone who is fairly young, and someone who fits the Greek ideal of the perfect body. The other person that we see that's not just a spectator in this story is Apollo. It is why they think that maybe the Temple of Hera, too, was considered to be, or was called the Temple of Apollo. Apollo in this scene is trying to command the centaurs and the lapis into a sense of order so that the race can go on in a more orderly fashion. So, what I want you to take away from this section about the temples at Paestum is that there were 3 temples, and because of the archaeology or because of the knowledge that they have from all 3 temples, we have a better idea of what the Greek temple life was like. It sort of fills in the gaps between the early Greek temples and the Parthenon. Also, I want you to see that the pediment sculpture is a very important part of the temple. It is a dedication to the gods and goddesses, and it often represents an idealized body type or an ideal set that is a set of perfection in Greek values. In Greek sculpture, we see that the archaic ideals are left behind, and Greeks are now looking at more naturalized, more humanistic style bodies that actually look like real people. One of those sculptures is this one called the Critias Boy. The Critias Boy has an idealized representation of what Greek society valued. He's youthful, physically fit, mentally composed, and fully engaged with the world around him. He looks out at you, the viewer. He likely had some sort of specialized material for the eyes. You can see the way in which the muscle structure underneath the skin is represented in a soft, supple way that is the shape and form of human skin. But there's something else that's really important in this sculpture, and that has to do with the way the Critias Boy stands. You see, up until now, we've seen statues that are pretty rigid and stiff looking. They tend to be very tall and very static. There is no movement. It's all very rigid. The arms are attached to the side of the hips. The feet stand very straight, one out in front of the other, and with this nice stiff pose compared to the Critias Boy. What is so different about the Critias Boy has to do with the way he stands. He stands in contrapposto. Contrapposto is the idea that, or is the word that we use to describe the way a human being naturally stands. They tend to stand with their weight fully on one leg, with one leg relaxed, which causes the hips to have a sense of, the hips have a natural slant to them, and then the spine adjusts for the shift in the weight, and then the shoulders have a counter slant. I'm going to draw you a picture of that on the next slide so that you can understand it a little bit more fully. But the point is that the Critias Boy at this point is the most realistic sculpture of a human being that has been done yet to date. It is the very first introduction of contrapposto, and it is a highly humanistic sculpture, meaning that when you look at it, you could easily see a human being in place of that sculpture. It's not a portrait. It is very idealized. I don't think if you went into a crowd, you could pick out a person that looks exactly like the Critias boy. But it does give you enough information to understand what the ideal Greek standard of beauty is. So let's break that contrapposto down just a little bit here. The Critias boy was a really big deal, probably one of the most important sculptures in the history of art that we have. It is the earliest known example of contrapposto. Contrapposto describes counterbalance. It's a word that's used to describe the natural stance of the human being at rest. We as human beings don't stand upright, erect, straight, with one foot out in front of the other and arms directly down at the sides. When we are standing in our natural state, relaxed, we tend to put our weight on one leg, which causes one hip to drop and a knee to relax. Then the spine counterbalances that, and the shoulders react in an opposite counterbalance. So you end up with three prominent angles and a fourth that's three prominent horizontal angles that dictate the shape of the human body. Then the axis of the spine, the vertical angle, finishes the stance. So anytime you take an art class and you're drawing figures, the first thing they teach you to do is figure out what angle the shoulders, hips, and knees are at, and then what angle the spine sits at. It dictates to you the general shape of what the structure of the body is going to look like. I think one of the things that we talk about the most with this sculpture is why. Why all of a sudden are we starting to depict people in a way that is less about the stiffness and rigidity of the form, the rigidity of the material, and more about what the human being actually looks like. So let's stop and think about the materials that we've seen so far. So I'm putting all four of these figures together so that you can see the rigid stance, from the materials that they used to the desire to represent the human figure in a hierarchy of power. And so on the left-hand side, you start with a work of art from ancient Egypt. Then in figure 2, you see the archaic style of representing the human figure. And 3, still archaic, because we still have that nice, solid, rigid stance with wide open, upright shoulders, hands stiffly down at the sides of the sculpture, and one foot out in front of the other. And then you see the Critias boy. You see how his hips tilt, the left leg is straight, and the right leg is slightly relaxed. Shoulders counterbalance that and are at an angle that is counterbalanced to the hips. So then the question becomes why? Why all of a sudden is this particular statue, the Critias boy, so much different? Well, number one, remember that they're made out of all very similar materials. Critias boy is made of marble. Marble is a very hard material that is aligned at a 90-degree angle and that is very stiff and rigid, just like diorite. So it's not so much about the material as it is what artists are studying. Stop and analyze what's going on in history. What were the Koros figures for? They were to memorialize Trojan soldiers. So I'm going to ask you this question. I'm going to plant it in your brain so that when you go do the delve deeper, you can possibly follow up in your compare and contrast essay with the idea of why all of a sudden are things feeling more human-like. Well, we have established that the Critias boy was very humanistic. We've also established that the Greeks are perfectionists at creating the human figure out of marble. In this case, we see the Rike warrior. The Rike warrior is named the Rike warrior because it was found off the sea in Rike, Italy. Basically, the Greeks perfect the depiction of the body so much so that they get bored with it. They get tired of making the perfect body. And so once they hit that mile marker, they move into a new state of hyperrealism. Depicting perfection really isn't as interesting as pushing art a bit further to depict hyperrealism. We see an over-exaggeration of muscles and the perfect muscle tone. If this guy were alive today, he'd be competing for the World Cup in some bodybuilding championship, right? This isn't what people generally tend to look like, but the Rike warrior does. It sets up this ideal of perfection that is unachievable. It sets up the idea that an ideal body is hyperhuman. It has strong, bulging muscles, and the ideal warrior is the most physically fit. That idea of the Marvel superheroes that we learn as a kid comes directly from Greek art. It starts with figures like the Rike warrior. Why? All because the Greeks were bored with representing the perfect human body. The Rike warrior was found on a ship that sank in antiquity. And we know that a lot of the bronze statues that are left from ancient Greece are statues that were found from ships that had sunk in the sea. Why do we not have a lot of bronze statues left? That has to do with the fact that bronze is a precious material that's very expensive. In addition to, when the Roman Empire falls, the Christians take over, and the Christians are very against the paganistic ways of the old worship of the polytheistic system. And so there's really no reason to keep alive sculptures like the Rike warrior. Instead, they melt them down for the bronze, for the precious material, and utilize them for their lavish churches. If you want to jump a little ahead, I'll give you a small preview of art history too. There's a very large sculpture in the Vatican that was done by taking as much of the bronze that the reigning pope could find and melting it down to create a large canopy, basically, called the Baldacchino, that sits in the Vatican today. So where are all our bronze Greek sculptures? They're in the Vatican. They're sitting in a completely different form, building an architectural archway. So this sculpture is a Roman copy of a bronze original that has been lost. It's a depiction of the ideal athlete. It's a discus thrower called the Discobolus. This copy survives due to the Roman craze for Greek sculpture in private homes and public places. The sculpture is unique in that it depicts an action just before it takes place, as if the sculptor froze a moment in time. We see rippling body muscles that are tense, getting ready to hurl a disc at great speed. Your textbook makes note that the face of the disc obelisk is completely relaxed. It lets us imagine that the body is in perfect form. This form may be partly based on the face that the disc obelisk was. This form might be partly based on the fact that the disc obelisk was designed as a pediment statue for the Temple of Aegina. You can see how the backward swing of the arm and how the crest of the spine would have fit nicely in a triangular pediment. But more importantly, I think that it's a unique statue because of the freezing of time that the artist has created. The sculptor's name is Myron. He's one of the first sculptors that we know of. As we get further and further in Greek art, sculpture lends itself to us being able to trace back to the artist, mostly because there's a place to stamp the name of the artist within the sculpture. Additionally, in my close-up, you can see how perfect the rippling of the muscles are. They are 100% symmetrical, meaning that they ripple in a way that is uniform. And they definitely help to shape Western civilization's ideas of what an athlete should look like, as well as Western civilization's ideas of the perfect male body. So this sculpture is done by Polyclitus. Polyclitus was a believer in Pythagoras' theorems. What is Pythagoras' famous theorem? I would ask you if I was standing in a classroom in front of you and one of you would tell me the Pythagorean theorem, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Pythagoras believed that all harmonious proportions could be found in nature and that the perfect statue would be constructed through a mathematical formula. The Doryphorus, or spear bearer, is probably one of the most copied Greek statues in all of the history of art. It stood as a model for Roman athletes in Pompeii, and it capitalizes on a concept called heroic nudity. Heroic nudity is the idea that we represent the body in a way that idolizes the subject of the statue. So here we're idolizing whoever's being represented in terms of athletic ability. Roman athletes would see these type of sculptures in places like bathhouses, and they would aspire to working out, to making their body look like the Doryphorus's body. I think the catch here, though, is that we switched from ultra-realistic to hyper-realism, and now we have an exaggerated sense of muscle structure. You can see that in the pectoral muscles, but it's most predominant in the abdominal muscles of the person of the sculpture. You can see at the sides to the right and left of the body, the abdominal muscles are bulging at the hips. Those bulging muscles are representation of a very strong, fit abdominal core. As well as we see these struts that are put in place to keep the statue stabilized. And this isn't something that I've talked about a lot in this lecture, and I really want to highlight it here because it's an important part of the way sculpture progresses. You see, part of the reasons the Egyptians held on to that rectangular form of the sculpture had to do with the fact that they're worried that the sculpture would be subject to breakage if an appendage would be loose from the sculpture. So by putting everything in closed form and everything sitting means that the sculpture is not likely going to get knocked over. The sculpture is likely going to have really great tensile strength. What does that mean? What is tensile strength? It's the idea that if the material gets knocked over, it's not going to break. Diorite has a very strong tensile strength. Marble, not quite as strong as diorite, right? So granite tends to be a little bit more durable than marble. Marble has a tensile strength that if it gets knocked over from a high place, likely you're going to lose limbs. The torso will probably stay intact, but you're going to lose legs and arms, as we saw in the Critias boy. So now that we're looking at Polyclitus's Doryphorus, we see that he's worried about the tensile strength of the statue. How do I know this? Because he's left a strut between the wrist and the upper thigh. That rectangular block that connects the wrist and the thigh is something that adds to the tensile strength of the sculpture. In addition to, we see this weird thing that stabilizes the back of the sculpture that Polyclitus disguises to look like a tree trunk. Now, this is a Roman copy from a bronze original. A lot of times, the Roman copies utilized these struts because the marble statue was so heavy that they were afraid it would just fall over. So we don't know if that was original to Polyclitus's design or whether or not the artist who copied Polyclitus's bronze sculpture perhaps was concerned about the sculpture toppling over. I can tell you that the bronze statue probably did have some sort of a strut, just because bronze is very heavy and wavers sometimes from side to side. So the point is here that they're still not confident that they can keep the sculpture erect without the strut. And they're still not confident that if the sculpture falls over, that they're not going to lose limbs. So, all in all, Polyclitus has not figured out how to completely free the sculpture from the block of stone. We call that liberation. The sculpture still has not been liberated from the block of stone. Okay, so right now I'm going to encourage you to take a short break. We're going to talk about the history and culture of classical Greece next. But I want you to take a break and kind of like stop here, go walk around, do something else for a while instead of listen to the lecture and come back to it, because the next section, you kind of need your whole head to be focused on what comes up in lecture. And if you've been watching lecture since the very beginning, you've listened to over an hour of it, and that means your brain is soggy. So take a break, go find something else to do, and come back to this in a little while, okay? All right, so we need to talk about the history and the culture of Athens at the beginning of the classical Greek era. So Greece is still organized into a city-state structure, and they're constantly at war to control natural resources. They want somebody else's resources, or they are trying to defend the resources that they have. So in 6th century BCE, Greece and Persia began to have some pretty major conflicts, and in the late 480s, Persia sacks Athens. A few years after Persia destroys the city of Athens, Athens makes an alliance with some other city-states in Greece. And the whole point of the alliance is to protect Greece from threats from the east. And they form a league called the Delian League. The league has an air of tyranny from the beginning because once you swear allegiance to the league, you can only get out of the alliance if the other city-states agree to let you out. In addition to the city of Athens is at its peak. It's at its peak culturally, it's at its peak politically, and so they take a lead in the Delian League. In their lead, the Delian League forms one common navy. The ships are built and manned by Athens, but other city-states pay costs to Athens for doing their work. Non-league members have to ask permission to trade or sail within Greece's ports, and Athenian coins replace all the other money. Athens then becomes the controller of commerce and trade in Greece. And because of that power, Athens becomes a very controlling entity. And it really begins with this one person, this man, Pericles. Pericles said freedom is the sure possession of those alone who have the courage to defend it. You see, Pericles begins forming a democracy. People who have sworn allegiance to the league have representation within the league. And so behaviors of democracy begin forming. Pericles converts the Delian alliance into an empire eventually. It really becomes the empire of Athens. Financially, Athens prevails, and he builds the Acropolis. But in his deciding to build the Acropolis, he doesn't have the money to do it alone. He decides that he's going to take the money that he's made from the Delian League and put it towards the building of the Acropolis. So the money that was going to Pericles, or going to Athens, was really supposed to protect Athens and the League from being attacked from the east. And instead of using that money for protection, they use it to build the Acropolis. The other city-states in the region feel controlled by Pericles, and they really are upset about his decision to use the money for the rebuilding of Athens. They were so upset about it that they said that Pericles was a terrible wanton insult, and that the funds that were contributed out of necessity for a common war effort were to gild and embellish itself with images and extravagant temples, like some pretentious woman decked out with precious stones. So obviously the city-states were very upset. And Athens, while it is a place of, it is the birthplace of democracy and democratic behaviors, it begins as a perversion of democracy from the beginning. All right, so we have talked a little bit about the Parthenon. The Parthenon was designed by two esteemed, not architects. They were architects because they designed the Parthenon, but in the beginning they weren't architects. They were philosophers and geometrists. Their names were Ichnos and Kilocrates. And they build the Parthenon at the highest point in the city, which they call the Acropolis. And the building's made to be viewed from any point within the city. So it's high up on a hill, and no matter where you're at in the city, the building is visible. It is the result of the Greek architect looking for ideal proportions in design. They believed that only harmonious numerical ratios could be present in nature, and therefore they should be, in order to achieve arete, they should be mimicked in their building. So the Parthenon is built on an algebraic formula, and that is x equal 2y plus 1. There are 8 columns on the temple's short sides and 17 columns on the temple's long sides. While it is mathematically proportionate to perfection, it has an oddity. And the oddity is that it is perfect, but it is so perfect that it accounts for human imperfection. It accounts for human imperfection with a concept called entasis. The stylobate, the entablature, and the columns all have entasis, meaning they swell slightly in certain areas so that they don't disappear in optical illusion when standing right in front of the building. Okay, so I'm going to break that entasis down for you a little bit more in the next slide. Let's keep talking about the Parthenon, though, to finish up this section. The Parthenon was created in a way that had an element of customization and hand building to it. That's true for most of the buildings that we've seen up until now, right? We've seen major monumental architecture that has some sense of customization when building it together. So like when we saw Stonehenge in the Neolithic times, I told you that those were ancient customized Legos, right? Like they were Legos, but the fitting pieces that pieced together only went with the ones that they were designed to go with. Well, the Parthenon is really no exception. The columns are created in customization to go specifically with that particular column. So they have, most of them have 4 to 5 sections because they're so tall, and each section is hand carved to go on the section below it, which means that basically they were customized Legos that all fit together only to go with that particular Lego. And so in the restoration efforts of the Parthenon, we cause some issues. The Parthenon's current state of repair is not so great, mostly because it was used for battering practice in some of the wars. In the Turkish wars, they set up battering rams and shot things out of the middle of it. Napoleon used it for battering practice as well, and so because of that, it has sustained some pretty major damage. It's pretty much got some major restoration that needs to go on. And the restoration artists are struggling to figure out what pieces go with what. If you're interested in the restoration of the Parthenon, I highly encourage you to look up information about it. The BBC does a great job of discussing the restoration of the Parthenon. It's a 2-hour special, and they talk about the ancient Legos and how they were formed and how they were built and where the rock was quarried. And they even talk about the challenges of restoring and using the same materials that were used in 447 BCE. The Parthenon is in Doric order, meaning that you can see that the drums at the top of the capitals are very simple. They have that D shape to them. And then if you look at the sculpture at the frieze, the sculpture rotates between the triglyph and the metapes. And then you see the Parthenon's, the Parthenon's roof line and the sculptural part of the roof line. It does have ionic elements in the floor plan, though. And we know that one of the two architects really wanted to include ionic elements within the building process. And so the floor plan is an ionic floor plan. But the main thing that you need to know is it's mostly built in Doric order. It is a hybrid of Doric and Ionic order. So I kind of wanted to show you a little bit of information about what entasis is. Basically, entasis is the slight swelling of an architectural element to account for optical illusion. So basically, the Greeks know that if I'm standing at the temple and my face is in front of one of the columns that recedes into space, and I'm standing square on, like directly in line of sight, all of the columns that are behind the column at the corner are going to disappear. They also know that the further you are away from the structure, at some point the center of the structure will disappear. And so they create a building using entasis. And entasis just means that the platform of the building curves slightly. So the stylobate, or the platform that is underneath the temple, curves upward in the center, and the sides form a shallow, or slope downward. It forms a shallow dome. The entablature, that is the triangular part of the pediment and the frieze, swells slightly in the center. And the columns lean slightly inward and bulge slightly in the center. So everything has its own sort of curvature to it. And they've done this to account for the human imperfection in our eyes. The way that our eyes optically take in information sometimes makes something disappear that is actually supposed to be there. And so because they know that, they are trying to account for our own human imperfections. This is an image of the Parthenon's floor plan. If you remember, originally I explained to you that the Parthenon was created in Doric order, but that it had some Ionic elements. The center of the Parthenon has Ionic elements. So the exterior columns and the exterior frieze are all in Doric order, but the interior columns and the interior cella and naos both are in Ionic order. The columns, I believe, in the interior are Ionic, as well as there is a frieze that is Ionic in the interior. I'm comparing to Temple of Hera 1, which was in the Archaic order, because, well, it was an archaic temple in the Doric order, because I want you to see how different the Parthenon looks compared to a Doric order temple. So it might seem like we're moving away from the Parthenon. We're moving away from the Parthenon, sort of. in that we're going to talk about the sculptures that were found with the Parthenon. We're going to talk about a few other structures within the Parthenon's temple complex. So these are the three goddesses. They're from the east pediment of the Parthenon, and you can just picture how they laid in the pediment in ancient Greece. All three of the goddesses are weighty. They feel large. Remember, they were pediment sculptures, so you were going to stand on the ground and look up at them from however tall the Parthenon is. They're weighty and they're a bit of a triangular shape, which utilized the natural shape of the Parthenon's triangular space. They have a few things that are very special about them. For one, you're seeing them in what we call wet drapery technique. And it's where the artist has clothed the goddess, but basically dressed the goddess in clothing that is very heavy looking and feels wet. And the idea is that the wet clothing would stick to the body and reveal the shape of the body underneath. You see three women, one crouched in the taller part of the pediment structure, one reclining, and the reclining woman rests on the reclining woman rests on the lap of the third goddess. The third goddess, her knees are turned towards the woman who's reclining, and you don't see as much of her body because the reclining woman blocks the view of her torso. You see the wet drapery cling to the legs of the goddess that is reclining, as well as the wet drapery cling to the top of the goddess's body, so you can see her breasts, or at least the shape of them. The wet drapery technique is an artistic solution to allowing the goddess to have some modesty, but still creating a sculpture that represents an ideal beauty and an ideal body form in terms of what an ideal woman would look like in Greek society. So I started out by telling you that these are the famous Elgin marbles. And I think I would be remiss to not give the Elgin marbles some attention in terms of appropriation in this class. Basically, Lord Elgin was a guy from the British Museum who went to Greece and excavated the Parthenon. And during the excavation, he found these statues on the ground, and he asked Greece if he could have them. And they said, "We don't care, go ahead and take them." So he takes them back to the British Museum. As time has gone on, Greece has been able to preserve the Parthenon. They've worked on an antiquity heritage project, and they've built a museum at the site of the Parthenon. Well, Greece has now gone to the British Museum and said, "Hey, we would like our marbles back." And of course, Lord Elgin has since retired a long, long time ago. And the British Museum says, "No, we're not giving them back." So we always discuss this. Who is the appropriate owner of the marbles? Who is the one who should rightfully claim the monies that come along with having something that's important from antiquity? I think Greece's recently in the last 10 years had to file for bankruptcy. I'm sure they could use the tourist traffic just as much as the British Museum. So all of those questions come into line when we talk about the appropriation of art, but we're also talking about the stealing or the taking of someone's heritage. If you're very interested in the Elgin marbles, there is a Delve Deeper this week that deals with the case of the Elgin marbles and gives you the opportunity to decide whether or not Lord Elgin should be giving the marbles back to Greece. So this is a relief panel from the Parthenon, done in 479 BCE. We talked about the Delian, the Delian League, the Delian group, and we talked about the people that Athens was at war with were the Persians. So keep that in mind as I tell you about this work of art. This work of art really highlights the concept of others. It represents a battle between the Lapis and the Centaurs. Athens plays a major role in this battle. The Centaur defeated the Greek in the depiction, and we see how much pathos goes to looking at the Greek victim. So the human on the ground is the Greek person who has been trampled by the centaur. The key here is that they often called the people who fought in the Persian Wars centurions. And so knowing that they were called centurions, it made sense that they represented the enemy as a centaur. Centaurs were not looked at in mythology as positive things, like I would think in our lifetime or in modern Western society, we wouldn't see anything negative about them, but in Greek mythology, they're not looked at as honest, forthcoming people. Pathos is something that I mentioned. Pathos is a concept in which we look at a work of art and we sympathize with a certain side. In this case, we sympathize with the Greek victim. This particular relief carving is extremely high relief. This is the only panel that we find in all of the Parthenon that is portrayed with the Greek being defeated. Why do you think they would want to treat, why do you think they would want to represent themselves in a sense of being defeated? Does it make sense that you're creating a work of art, an architectural work of art that is phenomenal, to add a defeated picture of the Greek people on the side of the Parthenon? Stop and think about reasons why someone might want to depict the people that they're honoring as being defeated. So really the answer to my probing question is hubris. Hubris is a concept that we see a lot in Greek art that warns against inflated pride or an inflated sense of pride. The Greeks are always trying to achieve arete. And because they're always trying to achieve arete, it's easy when you're striving for perfection to get a big head when you're successful at perfection. And so they also warn against this concept of hubris. Their warning is that hubris leads to suffering, making way to learning man's place in the world. So, what does that mean overall? It means that they feel that hubris is something that if you have too much hubris, then the gods will punish you or something bad will happen, and then you'll have to suffer to see where your place really is in the world. So, how does that go with this relief panel? Well, if their pride is too inflated because they've built this huge pantheon, this marvelous dedication to the gods, if they think that they're all big and mighty, they're trying to remember that they have weaknesses, and their weaknesses were very well represented when they fought the war against the Persians. The centurions and the lapis were honorable enemies, but at the Parthenon, they're giving thanks to Athena for being able to come out on top in the war and to be able to build such a magnificent structure as the Parthenon. But they're also remembering that there are enemies out there that could be very dangerous to them. That's kind of the idea of you keep your friends close and your enemies closer. It's always important to be aware of your enemy's strengths so that you don't lose your own. Okay, so to continue on with our study of the Parthenon was really the most lavish temple that the Greeks had ever built. On the exterior, it had 92 scenes in the metopes, and on the interior of the temple, it had an Ionic frieze that was 542 feet long. Inside the temple was the most expensive statue of them all, Phidias' statue of Athene. She was made of gold and ivory, and she was colossal in size, 38 feet tall. She's considered one of the ancient wonders of the world. Or one of the wonders of the ancient world, sorry. Gardner claims that Ichnos designed the statue around Phidias' design. I haven't read that anywhere else. I see the point that he's making. The point that he's making is that there are a lot of clues to the triumph of the Greeks over the Persians in this particular statue. And I agree that it elevates the whole entire structure elevates the Athenians as the victors and as the superior race. So yes, I think that it was a factor, but to say the Parthenon was built around Phidias' sculpture seems a stretch to me, because I haven't read that anywhere else. Your textbook will tell you all the little details of this statue that represent the triumph of Athens over the Persians. One of them is that on her sandals there's a word that's printed that represents the Persians. Just to get an idea of how tall she is, the Athena Nike the Nike that she holds in her hand is 6 feet tall. You can see to the right, I've included this slide that has a regular sized Greek person in it. The base that she stands on is a little less than a little bit over 5 foot. so you can kind of get an idea of how big she really is. She's a cult statue, and she's colossal. So colossal just refers to her size. The first statues that we looked at that were colossal in size were in Egypt at Abu Simbel of Ramses. So here you're looking at a colossal statue as well. And you're looking at a statue that's made of the most expensive materials Greeks can find, right? It's made of ivory and gold. They've used repoussé in creating the breastplate of her dress. And you can see the gold sheeting that drapes around her torso and around her legs that she stands in contrapposto, so she has a little bit more lifelikeness to her, but she's pretty tall, so she's tall and covered, so you really can't tell exactly what the shape of her body is. I think the idea from that is that Phidias wants you to see her warrior likeness. He's not interested in her ideal sense of beauty at this point in time. They revere her because she is the goddess of victory for them. And so she's looked at as a strong warrior. The statue is a cult statue, which means that a priest would have come in every day and fed her, clothed her, and made libations to her. So in ceremonial process, he would have fed her and clothed her, and rituals would have gone around doing all of those things. It's why we call her a cult statue. Well, the other thing that we talk about when we talk about sculpture in the Parthenon is the Pantheonic Festival that is represented in the interior temple. The interior of the temple, so the Parthenon was really two temples in one. The exterior was Doric, and on the inside was an Ionic style temple. It had a peristyle with an Ionic frieze, and I just explained in the last scene, or the last slide, that the frieze was really large. It was 542 feet long. And it basically honored the festival that the festival celebration of Athena. So every 4 years there was a big, huge pantheonic festival that honored Athena. And this relief sculpture ran around the frieze of the interior of the Parthenon, and it depicted scenes from the festival. The first scene that you can see, the one at the bottom, is the scene in which priestesses stand in line to wait and greet the goddess with offerings. The one above it is a banquet in her honor. You can see that men and women are banqueting together, and that's because the women are goddesses. The four horsemen of the North frieze is also part of that frieze procession at the Acropolis. And you can see that it is a war scene, a scene in which they are at war with the Persians. Okay, so Menescles built the Propylaea. The Propylaea is in part of the temple complex where the Parthenon is, so it's just another building within the temple complex. Menescles built the Propylaea on a steep slope, and so he splits the building into an eastern and western two-sectioned building. The exterior of the temple is designed in Doric order, but the interior design was in Ionic, just like the Parthenon. The building was never fully finished, though, because of the Peloponnese War. Only the west wing was completed. We know that the Pantheonic processional took place every 4 years, went right through the temple, and it's why the opening between the center two columns is so large. The Romans, though, used the Propylaea as a gallery space to display paintings that were painted on wood. And so this building is significant because it foreshadows the modern day art museum. So the Erechtheion is another one of those temples within the temple complex that was built on uneven ground. The site was said to be where the king of Athens, sorry, I can't remember his name. It'll pop up here in a minute. The king of Athens at the time decides the outcome of a contest between Athena and Poseidon, in which Athena stakes her claim as Athens' patron goddess. She does this by instantaneously growing a tree, and the king declaring her the winner. So it's part of Athens' history. It's part of Athens' historical lore in terms of why it's called Athens and why their patron goddess is Athena. Like all cities in Greece, the patron goddess would have a myth that went along with, or a story that went along with the city's history. That would explain how that goddess or god got to be the patron goddess of this city. Because it is built on uneven terrain, and because they didn't want to build terraces on the terrain, because they didn't want to disturb what was considered to be a sacred site since the contest had taken place on that soil, the building sort of has an odd shape to it. Most Greek temples are very asymmetrical. Like if you slice them in half, they would be exactly the same on each side. But in this case, the building is longer than it is wide, which is just unusual. And the architect is someone that has, we don't know who he is. His name has been lost in history. And we find that the building has some unique details because of its odd shape. We don't know for sure that that's what was in the architect's mind. It's definitely what Gardner claims is why the building's odd shaped. I would say that it's just unique in that way. What's so unique about it is probably this porch. The porch of the Erechtheion that looks northwest has 7 pillars that are replaced with sculptures of females. Now, one side of the building has Ionic columns, and the other side has Doric columns. So once again, that hybrid of the Ionic and the Doric plans are spliced together. And then we have these unique statues that take place of the columns on the porch. These statues are called caryatids. They are basically female statues that act as the column to support the building. And you can see that the porch overlooks an area that is high up, and so the background is this beautiful picturesque view of the mountain. So what's the big deal? Why are we focused on caryatids? Well, because there was this little thing in the United States called feminism that happened in Western art culture and Western culture altogether. And feminists have made a big deal out of these sculptures stating that the women are being oppressed. They're being oppressed because they're being forced to stand there and hold up the roof of the building. Most of the time I ask my classes to discuss this, and they come up with some unusual answers. One of the things that commonly is stated is that if the women weren't there, the roof would fall, it would collapse. And so in some ways, you could look at this as the women are prominent, important, supportive members of society, and that the architect is helping to pay homage to their contribution. Now, we do think that they are goddesses because they are pictured in the heavy wet drapery technique. You can see the ideal shape of the body, but they do wear that wet drapery clothing that clings to the body just like a goddess would be represented in high classical Greece. We saw them in the pediment statues for the Parthenon. We're going to see a few more here in just a minute. This is Kallikrates' temple of the Athena Nike. And because this temple exists, we think that Kallikrates might have actually been the one responsible for including the Ionic order within the Parthenon. The temple is the entrance for Athena's sanctuary, and it commemorates the victory of the Greek people over Persia. Here you see one of the sculptures from the temple of Athena Nike, the Nike adjusting her sandal. It's from the south side of the parapet of the temple. And what you see is the Nike leaning over to the right to adjust her sandal. And as she does so, her body is sort of in this precarious position. But the way the wet drapery flows around the body reveals the shape of the ideal body. You can see the ideal form of the female figure. It isn't large busted, it isn't robust, it isn't, in today's words, thick. It is definitely curvy, but also sensuous in the way that the Nike moves. The Nike is a word that they used in Greek mythology. She is the personification of victory. We're going to see a lot more of those personifications of something. But for now, just know that the Nike is the personification of victory. And as she leans over to buckle her sandal, we see this beautiful, graceful motion of the wet drapery that clings to her body in a very linear way. This is a relief carving, and it is fairly high relief. Another important relief carving that gave us some good idea of what the higher class society lived like is this grave stele of Hegeso from the Dyflon Cemetery. It's the same cemetery that geometric crater comes from. Hegeso is seated. She's seated with her foot on a stool, meaning that she's a higher class than the servant who serves her. This sculpture sort of highlights that others concept that we talked about in the relief of the lapis in the center, or the centurion. So really, it's sort of as if the servant is not part of the inner circle of high-class people, basically. The servant holds a jewelry box and holds it for Hegeso to choose a piece of jewelry from the box. The servant wears a chiton, which is a simple gown compared to Hegeso's elaborate dress. Hegeso is dressed in a gown that has somewhat drapery technique. It doesn't have full weight drapery technique because typically only goddesses were allowed to be shown in full drapery technique. It didn't leave enough modesty for a respectable woman. This is a genre scene. A genre scene is a scene from everyday life. It's a moment that could happen in any wealthy woman's life, right? That a slave's bringing her a jewelry box to figure out what to wear for the day. I do that every day. I go to my jewelry box, pick out a piece of jewelry, put it on. I don't have a slave that does it for me or someone who brings me a box. But it's just something that we as women do a lot. Or sometimes, I suppose men pick out jewelry too. And so the choosing of jewelry attests to the wealth of Hegeso's father. Hegeso is picking a necklace out of the box that represents her dowry. Hegeso being depicted out of the house is significant because it's a rare occasion that we see Greek women in public. The grave stele is a testament to the order of Greek life, to the patriarchal order of Greek life. The dowry that went with Hegeso would have made her more attractive for marriage. In addition to, we think that Hegeso probably died in childbirth, and that is why the representation of the dowry, it's why the representation of picking a necklace for a special occasion. All right, so we're going to move on to late classical Greece. So Greece is now in a full-blown war. It's the Peloponnesian War, and Athens is defeated. The Greeks feel like they need more power, and so the city-states fully unite. Alexander the Great takes over in the 4th century and expands the empire into Egypt. There's a political upheaval, and it changes art. The individual becomes more prominent, and a collective idealism that we see in the Parthenon and in the Doryphorus cease. Remember that the statues of the Doryphorus, the statue of the Discobolus, represent a collective idea of a goal to strive for in terms of perfection. It speaks to a community of people. The main writer publishing at this time is Pliny the Elder, and because of his written works, we know a lot more about Greek life. Well, this is Aphrodite of Kindos. She's depicted as a goddess without clothing, which has been very rare until now. Up until now, we've only seen goddesses in wet drapery technique. We see in the Archaic period nudity, but it sort of fades, and then we see it again here. So what are the Archaic period and the Aphrodite of Kindos, or the cultural period of Greece in the late classical era, have in common? What they have in common is that the society has been weakened by war. The statue that Praxiteles sculpts, the Aphrodite of Kindos, is sold to the city of Kindos, and it made the area famous. Many people would go there just to see the sculpture. And we can see the same individuality that we see here in Aphrodite of Kindos and Praxiteles' sculpture of Hermes and Dionysus. You can see that the artist is still having a difficult time liberating the statue from the block of stone. There are still struts there. In the Aphrodite of Kindos, the strut is disguised by her taking off her clothing and draping it over a vase. That decorative way to display the strut is actually, or sort of that decorative way to play up the strut, is a major support system for the statue. As well as you can see, there is a tensile strength strut that attaches the statue to the tall strut with a vase in the clothing. Praxiteles follows a little bit different canon of proportions than the sculpture of the spear bearer. So this is his version of Hermes and Dionysus, and you can see he did the same trick with the strut that he did with Aphrodite of Kindos. He uses the strut as, he disguises the strut here as a tree with clothing draped over it. So he's taken that clothing that normally the god or goddess would have worn, and in Aphrodite's case, the wet drapery technique, and just decided he's going to remove the clothing altogether. The sculptures don't have the superhuman look that we saw at the end of the early classical period. Instead, they have a great sense of humanity to them. They're less pronounced in muscle structure. They're more personable. You feel like you could probably pick somebody out of a crowd that looked like this. And so there's more of a humanistic approach here. When wartime happens, it's not that the Greeks are trying to not depict themselves as warriors. They need their gods and goddesses close to them and relatable so that they have comfort over the death that is brought about by war. Praxiteles really Praxiteles' work sets the bar for sculpture in the late classical period. He develops a canon of proportions. Those canon of proportions are followed. He develops this technique of representing the gods or goddesses in a more human type form. And he develops the idea of the body not having to look like an Olympic athlete in order to be beautiful. He definitely sets a mark for what it is that is ideal beauty in Greek society. Then when we compare the new classical Greek work, or the late classical Greek work, to the high classical Greek work, all of a sudden you easily see the differences between the goddesses. One is nude, she's just a human being. The other one is this Amazon looking woman that I don't think anybody would want to run up against in battle. She's the great protector. She's the great victor. She's the great winner. She's the strength that won Athens' independence, or that helped Pericles create tyranny, depending on how you look at it. The other thing that Praxiteles does so beautifully is that he's able to figure out how to polish the statue in a way that's tender and soft, so that the skin texture feels like it comes through the sculpture. You can see how the sculpture captures the light gently and makes the body feel more soft and relatable. One thing I want to point out to you about Praxiteles' work is that now he's figured out that he wants to free the statue from the block of stone as much as possible. He makes sure that the statue stands in contrapposto. It has a natural look to the skeletal structure. But as Aphrodite's arm reaches over and holds her robe, that piece that is the hand is independent of the statue. So they're starting to liberate that statue from the block of stone. A lot of times they do this with arms and legs. There's a joint that has a socket, and then the arm will fit into that socket joint. So this is Lysippus's scraper, and while Praxiteles develops a more humanistic approach, his canon of proportions doesn't last, and Lysippus comes along and creates a new canon of proportions. And that canon of proportions is one that we use today. It's a 1:8 ratio for men and a 1:7 ratio for women. And what that means is the sculpture is 8 heads tall for a man and 7 heads tall for a woman. So when you take a drawing class, the first thing they do is tell you to figure out like how big the head is and how big it is compared to the height of the person. And if you know that your person should be about 7 heads tall, you kind of measure that out on your page. So it's a guide, right? It's a guide to figure out how to represent people. It's a guide to scale. Lysippus, really, his claim to fame is that he's the sculptor for Alexander the Great. His bodies are thinner than Polykleitus's sculptures, and so they just have a little bit different look to them. They still have the strut. In fact, this one in Lysippus's scraper, the strut, he doesn't even try to hide it. It's just part of the statue. The scraper reaches out forward, and what he's doing is a process called striggling. Striggling was something that was done by athletes. So in the Greek times, the Olympic Games were done in the nude. And so they would take an oil and oil their body so that the friction of the body didn't cause the skin to stick together and slow them down. So if you can think about running, you would definitely want your body to move in a fluid motion. And at the end, when the athlete is done, he will have a pile of sweat and oil, a whole layer of sweat and oil on his body. And so he would take this tool called a striggler that kind of looked like a paint roller without the roller on it. Anyway, he would scrape his skin with the striggler. And then you want to hear something really gross? Women would go around and collect the oil and the sweat in vials and use it as perfume. Yep, I grossed you out for the day. This is obviously a Roman copy of a bronze original statue. I believe the statue is in the Vatican today, and it's part of Roman heritage as Romans see their heritage. So you see that they've put a leaf over the genitals of the scraper. I bet the original didn't have things to hide the naughty bits. This is a mosaic by Philoxenios of Eretria, and it depicts the Battle of Issus in Pompeii at about 310 BCE. And unfortunately, because you're looking at this on a small screen, I can't really communicate to you the spectacular look of the mosaic. This mosaic has an incredible variation to it in terms of the way the mosaic shows light and dark shadows. It's made of something called tesserae, which are small pieces of glass, and we'll go over tesserae more in depth when we get to early Christian because that's where it's used more. But it's made of small pieces of glass that are colored, and some of those glasses have a mirrored backing. And so when the pieces of glass are placed into the mural, some of them catch the light. And so you get this really interesting sense of dimension that comes from the mosaic, which is rare. When you get into the early Christian mosaics, they're a lot flatter looking than this. In the mosaic up close, you can see incredible detail and color variation that's very subtle. This is an innovative mosaic because it depicts the horse in a 3/4 profile, which is really hard to do. If you've ever watched a horse run, one of the things that you notice are every single one of those muscles that ripple in the horse's body. Horses are these really powerful, muscular creatures. And Felixenio captures the rippling effect of the muscles through value variation in the mosaic tiles. It's just breathtakingly beautiful. It also depicts reflective light, which is something that's a first, and it depicts what we call modeling. Modeling is the idea that when something has volume to it, as it turns away from the light, it gets darker. I'm going to show you a close-up here in a minute. It also depicts cast shadows, and this is one of the very first representations of cast shadows from a single light source. The thing that's really impressive is the drama that's captured by this scene, and the drama is created by these long swords that create really prevalent angles, harsh angles that are very directional. Here, I just wanted to give you a quick close-up of a detail of the mosaic. This is one of the horses that's fallen. And you can see it barely, like I said, I sure wish that I could show you this up close where you could see the different individual tesserae, but you can see that the artist has captured the veining that's happened in the horse's face from losing blood. But you can also see the rippling of the muscle structure in the neck. Okay, this is the Greek theater at Epidaurus. The theater was an interesting place in Greek society. It was a place of tragedy. It was a place of dedication. Greek plays were dedicated to the patron god or goddess. They were dedicated to the gods or goddesses that they were honoring for the festivals, for sacred festivals. So the theater was associated with a religious rite. And it's quite a remarkable structure. It's 387 feet in diameter, and it seats 12,000 spectators. You enter the theater just like you would a stadium from underneath. And at one point, there were marble seats that lined the entire theater, but they've been since stolen and taken for their material throughout the Middle Ages. The area up front that you see, the small rectangular area that's at the front, is called a skene. There are dressing rooms there for the actors, and they make backdrops to sort of set the scene for the play. Greek theater is an important part of Greek society. And In 323, Alexander the Great dies, and the Greek Empire, is divided among the Greek kings. The kings become rich on the trading from the eastern part of the empire, and it creates an interesting rift in art. It defines a new artistic period called the Hellenistic period. This is the dying Gaul. He's a victim of the battle at Pergamon. The Gaul is from a Gaelic nation, so a nation to the north. And here we see him depicted with long, bushy hair and a mustache and a band of roping around his neck. He's depicted as a barbarian. He represents the hated foe that was othered by Greek society. This particular work of art was placed on the altar of Zeus, and so we get this sense of drama that comes from late Hellenistic art. The Romans called anybody who wasn't Roman a barbarian. So the people from the north would have been called barbarians in Greek society. You can see it at his feet. There's a whip that is at the base of his feet. The whip has been likely used on him. The rope around his neck shows that he's been captured. You still get this nice, soft, supple sense of musculature underneath the skin. It really has a sense of pathos to it. It tugs at your heartstrings. The Gaul looks downward in a stance of defeat. It's as if he's lost all hope. I think the texture of the skin versus the texture of the hair really brings out that feeling of barbarianness. In addition to, the marble isn't white and squeaky clean, it's polished, but then it oiled with a color to bring out the texture of the hair. This sculpture is so very detailed. The feet have veining in them. You can see each individual knuckle in the toe. You can see the fingernail or the toenail of the feet. Okay, so I always feel, badly about only giving the Venus de Milo a sort of short tribute, but this lecture's already 3.5 hours, so I'm going to try to just tell you a little bit about the Venus de Milo and sort of move on. She's based on Praxiteles' Aphrodite of Kindos. And, your book makes this point that not only do they pay tribute to Praxiteles in the use of his canon of proportions and his approach to the soft and suppleness of the skin, but they also follow his lead on making the gods and goddesses nude. But here, Alexandros of Antioch on the Meander really wants to explore the sexuality of the goddess. He wants to explore the sexual appeal. He wants to explore the idea of ideal beauty and the approach to allure in art. And so he sculpts the Venus de Milo with this drapery sort of almost falling off of her lower abdomen. Gardner says this is more modest than the Aphrodite of Kindos, whereas the Aphrodite of Kindos sort of just has a full sense of nudity. There's really nothing left up to the imagination. And here, the Venus de Milo has this sense of allure to it, a sense of, um, oh, I suppose like anticipation, because the drape seems as if it's almost falling off. Like I said, Gardner sets more modestly. I think maybe a little bit more modest, but definitely Alexandros of Antioch achieves his goal of allure. We know that her left hand held an apple at one time that she was awarded when she was being judged the most beautiful goddess. And she is tantalizing. She's sexual. She's the goddess of love. She's tall. She's 6'7" high, so almost 7 feet. She's at the Louvre. If you go to the Louvre and have lunch, you can sit down and eat lunch and look at the Venus de Milo while you eat lunch. This slide has a picture of a woman standing next to the Venus de Milo, so you can kind of see how tall the sculpture really is, but also remember that the sculpture is elevated on a pedestal, so that helps get some height there. I've included this detail of her face and her upper torso so you can see how Alexandros uses the marble to create light and shadow. The face turns away from the body a little bit, so the torso bends a bit, and it creates a more lifelike feeling to the sculpture. Here you get all three sides of the sculpture. I just kind of wanted to show you the back and how much detail the sculpture has from the back to the front. Obviously, the artist has spent a great deal of time studying the female figure, the female anatomy, how the skin lays on top of the muscles, and just beautifully captures the figure in a way that hasn't really been done quite the same. Praxiteles attempts it, but I don't think it's quite as humanistic and quite as realistic as this particular sculpture. Here's a comparison between the Venus de Milo and Praxiteles' Aphrodite of Kindos. It has been pointed out to me that they're two different goddesses, that the Venus de Milo is the goddess of sexuality and love, whereas the Aphrodite of Kindos is a goddess of something different. I just can't remember what she is goddess of. I apologize. So to some degree that could attribute to the differentiation between the alluring depiction versus sort of the more just humanistic access to the gods and goddesses that Praxiteles explores. Well, here is probably my one of my most favorite of all works of art, the Nike of Samothrace from Greece. She's from 190 BCE, so you can see that we're definitely getting much closer towards the year 1 in the Common Era. She's 8 feet high, and she's at the Louvre. The Louvre has a hall of sculpture that you walk down. So you descend a set of stairs to a plateau of sculpture, and then you go up another set of stairs. And when you get to the top of that second set of stairs, you look up, and there is the Nike of Samothrace. She's in sort of an alcove at the Louvre, and you have to walk up 2 more flights of stairs to actually get to her. This is where my heart is saddened that I am not in the classroom with you so that I can show you this magnificent sculpture on a large screen. Um, the Nike of Samothrace was sculpted to adorn the prow of a ship, and the Louvre displays her in a way that mimics the ship underneath her. So you kind of see this pedestal. Remember, a Nike is a personification of victory, and this particular Nike doesn't have arms, she only has wings. Um, it is where Nike gets their name for tennis shoes, just FYI. And you can see the wet drapery technique that's used to create the feeling of the Nike being at the prow of the ship. So if you can kind of backtrack for me a little bit and think about when you were probably much younger and seeing the movie Titanic. Do you remember that scene where Kate Winslet is standing at the prow of the ship and Leonardo DiCaprio is standing behind her, and he tells her to climb up the ropes of the ship and to hold her arms out lengthwise behind her. And she has this magnificent sense of freedom that comes from this. This is the stance that the Nike of Samothrace is in, and I would be willing to bet that the producer of that movie has seen this work of art. This work of art is just so incredible in terms of movement. You see the wind rushing up against the body of the Nike. You can almost feel it when you're standing there looking at the sculpture. What's the artist doing that's so successful? He's undercutting the marble. The clothing has deep crevices in the marble that make it seem as if it's highly textured. It catches the light and projects the clothing up off of the body. In addition to, the clothing has such a fabulous texture to it that as she stands at the prow of the ship, you see this rush of water come up at her, or you can imagine the rush of water that comes up at the body. She's standing at the prow of the ship. The sea is just raging up against the body, and the wind is blowing her clothing behind her. I've included this side view of the sculpture, and I'll include a couple more images of the sculpture after the slide so you can just kind of see what that you can see what I'm describing here in terms of the water. She's meant to represent the personification of victory. To me, she has so many qualities that the Greeks value. She has an ultimate sense of beauty. She has a sense of victory and presence that I don't think we often see women in society. We don't often attribute to women in society, especially ancient Greek society. And so I hope that as I include these extra pictures that you really enjoy the Nike of Samothrace the way I have, and that someday you get to experience it for yourself at the Louvre, because it's an experience that I really couldn't explain to you. It's like trying to explain what it's like to stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon versus looking at a picture of it. It's just there are no direct words that can put your viewer or reader right there. So here are two more images of the Nike of Samothrace, and here you can see an image standing at the base of the sculpture looking upward. It shows you that great undercut I was talking to you about in the fabric, and it shows you how well the fabric sort of clings to her body. You can even see her belly button. You know, one of the things that I always ask my students is whether or not you wish that she had a face and a head and arms. I always say the same thing. I don't want her to have a face or a head or arms. I like the graceful or the very dynamic direction that the wings bring in conjunction with the shape of the body. If you put a head there, then you're going to obstruct the beautiful swoop that comes out from the shape of the sculpture. So, yeah, think about it. Would you like to see a head there, or do you like it the way it is? All right, well, Hellenistic art is, I'm telling you, my absolute favorite type of Greek art. And it has to do with the amount of emotion that's shown in the work of art. This piece really is no exception. It's a Greek statue that was created for a Roman patron, and it's called the AH1. The AH1 was a Trojan priest. The two other figures are the priest's sons, and it depicts an attack on the AH1 by sea serpents. He's getting ready to make a sacrifice at the altar to the gods, and the gods are angry with him. He's created he's in the middle, intertwined in the tale of espionage. He's getting ready to warn the Greeks about the Roman, or maybe it's the other way around, warn the Romans about, he's going to warn somebody about the Trojan horse. You know, the Trojan horse is that structure that looks like a horse that really isn't a horse, that snuck all these people into battle, and then they climb out of the horse and they're able to win based on the element of surprise, the battle. And so the gods are angry with him because he's warned someone about this Trojan horse, and they send a sea serpent to attack him. And I know you can't tell from this far back view. I'm going to give you some close-up pictures in a minute, but the amount of pain that the AH1 is in is immense. You can see that he had on a robe, his sons had on robes, and they are hanging from their bodies in different places. Every muscle in the AH1's body ripples, is tensed in agony. When you see this particular work of art at the Uffizi, it's really breathtaking in terms of the texture and the emotion that is shown on the faces. The young boys, you can see, have been tangled up in the sea serpent's grip, and they're trying to free themselves. The one boy seems like he's getting away. The other boy is completely engulfed in this serpent. And here you see the face of the AH1. You can see the deep undercut of the texture of the hair, the beard, all of that. But I think the thing that's most gripping is the texture of the brow, the texture of the face, the way the eyes are drawn upward in agony. Here you can see that close-up that I promised you of the body of the AH1. You can see the muscles in his torso rippling from being injected with the poison of the sea serpent. And you can see the dramatic angles that happen within the sculpture. I think that's part of why the sculpture is so very emotional. It has so much action going on in it. It has a lot of direction uh, because of the motion of the AH1 reaching back to try to grab the serpent away from his body. Okay, this is the Old Market Woman. Towards the very, very end of the Greek Empire, we see a new genre of subject matter being explored, and that is the genre of the lower rungs of society, the lower ranks of society. Shepherds and beggars and drunkards and fishermen and slaves are all fair game in terms of subject matter. And we hadn't seen that before. Before this, the common everyday person wasn't worthy of a sculpture, right? Everybody that was being sculpted was for temples. They were gods and goddesses. And so now you've got sort of a slice of Greek life. The artists are interested in exploring a deep sense of realism. The woman that you see in front of you is a slave. She carries a basket. The basket is full of little chicks, and they're a metaphor for life. The chicks, the peeps, are in the basket, and then she carries a carcass on her hip of a dead chicken. She's going to the market. She's going to the market to sell her chicks and to purchase whatever she needs at the market. She likely works for a family. Her face is wrinkled. We see that she's had a very hard, difficult life. Here's a close-up of the market woman's face. You can see that it's haggard, that she's in pain, that she's not respected by society by any means. I had a professor once who told me that she felt like these statues were cruel because they made fun of the aging of women, because they didn't glorify or dignify the aging process for people in society that were like the Old Market Woman. I kind of think that it really wasn't so much about giving dignity as it was exposing the life that they had. And in some ways, perhaps the artist wanted you to be able to connect with the Old Market Woman. He wanted you to be able to have some sense of comfort if this was you. Something I wanted to point out to you is part of the drama that comes from this particular statue has to do with the way she stands. She stands very hunched over. She's hunched over because she's in pain. She's hunched over because she's lived a life of hard, back-breaking work. The last woman that I knew that was hunched over like this had worked as a janitor at a hospital for years and couldn't stand up straight because her back was bothering her so much. And then, you see in the close-up picture that I've provided for you, the garment that she wears, her dress, just seems to cling to her body, and her breast almost falls out of it because she's so emaciated. She hasn't been well fed, she hasn't been well taken care of. You can see her collarbone quite clearly. You can see parts of her sternum, and because of that, she doesn't seem as if anybody's taking care of her, including herself. And it adds to the feeling of pathos that you have for her life.